In the year 1902, an island in the Caribbean was forever changed by a force of nature so destructive, it wiped out an entire city in a matter of minutes. What was thought to be a peaceful mountain turned into an unstoppable force, leaving nothing behind but ash and devastation. This is Tales of History, where we uncover the stories that have shaped our world. Today we look at the deadliest volcanic eruption of the 20th century. But how did it happen, and what caused 30,000 lives to end in mere minutes? At the dawn of the 20th century, Martinique was a jewel of the Caribbean, a French colony where life moved to the slow rhythms of sun, sea, and sugar. Known as the Island of Flowers, its rolling hills and dense rainforests seemed untouched by time. On the northwestern coast sat the bustling town of Saint-Pierre, the beating heart of the island's culture and commerce. With nearly 30,000 inhabitants, it was often called the Paris of the Caribbean, a place where cobbled streets met elegant cafes, colorful markets overflowed with spices and fruit, and the harbor was alive with the creak of wooden ships. The people of Saint-Pierre lived well. Merchants, plantation owners, artisans, and workers moved through a daily rhythm rich with French traditions and Caribbean spirit. Life here was vibrant, orderly. And looming above it all, a giant, Mount Pelée. Rising over 1,300 meters, the mountain was an ever-present figure in the background, majestic, green, and seemingly benign. The locals respected it, but few feared it. Mount Pelée had slept peacefully for generations, its flanks blanketed with forests and farms. The volcano had long ago shaped the island's landscape, but in living memory, it was no more threatening than the ocean breeze. It was part of the scenery. But as the calendar turned to 1902, small signs, faint and easy to overlook, hinted that the giant was beginning to stir. The first signs were subtle. In late April, farmers working on the slopes of Mount Pelée reported strange phenomena: a faint smell of sulfur in the air, thin plumes of smoke twisting into the sky, small tremors underfoot. But life continued as usual. In a place shaped by nature's whims, a little smoke from the mountain wasn't enough to cause alarm. Inside Saint-Pierre, the chatter of markets and the clinking of glasses at the cafes drowned out any whispers of concern. The newspapers mentioned minor activity, but reassured the public. After all, volcanoes were part of island life, weren't they? On April 23rd, Mount Pelée unleashed a loud rumble that echoed across the countryside. It startled livestock and rattled windows, but again, many brushed it off. Local officials consulted experts who concluded it was merely a venting of gases, an inconvenience, not a threat. Over the following days, the mountain's smoke grew thicker, darker. Ash began to drift down like gray snow, coating rooftops and gardens in a fine dust. The air turned heavy, acrid. Yet the people of Saint-Pierre remained. The churches held their Sunday services. The shops opened each morning. Life went on, stubborn and proud. By April 27th, tremors became frequent and animals grew restless. Some villagers in outlying areas packed their belongings and left. But in Saint-Pierre, confidence reigned. Government officials and businessmen insisted there was no danger. Moving thousands of people would cause chaos, and elections were just days away. Then, on April 30th, a strange sight appeared. The Rivière Blanche, A river flowing from Mount Pelée turned thick and muddy. Dead animals floated downstream. The mountain summit was now cloaked in a permanent shroud of ash, and at night, a dim red glow could be seen against the sky. Whispers of fear grew louder, but in the town square, the mayor reassured the people once more. There is no cause for panic. The month of May started with unease. In Saint-Pierre, a fine layer of volcanic ash now coated everything: roofs, streets, and windowsills. The air had a sulfurous tang, and the mountain above was no longer just smoking. It was grumbling. On the 2nd of May, the mountain produced loud explosions, earthquakes, and a massive pillar of dense black smoke. Ashes and fine-grained pumice covered the entire northern half of the island. The explosions continued at 5 to 6 hour intervals. Farm animals started dying from hunger and thirst as their sources of water and food were contaminated with ash. The mood in town had changed, but not dramatically. Most citizens remained. Many trusted the local authorities and newspapers, which continued to downplay the danger. The mayor, the governor, and even scientific observers insisted it was a minor event, a spectacle perhaps, but nothing life-threatening. But not everyone was so certain. In the countryside, farmers and workers who lived closer to the volcano had seen firsthand the mountain's restlessness. The cracks in the ground, the dead animals near the Rivière Blanche, and the persistent tremors. Many packed up and fled. Some went south to Fort-de-France. Others, ironically, came to Saint-Pierre, believing the city, with its size, resources, and presence of authorities, would be the safest place to wait things out. Estimates suggest that over 1,000 people from nearby villages had moved into the city in just a few days. Still, the daily rhythms of urban life continued. Businesses opened, schools held classes, and political campaigning for the upcoming elections carried on. Volcanic ash, now falling regularly, was swept off doorsteps like it was nothing more than dust. The mountain smoked, and the people adapted. But beneath that calm surface, pressure was building, and the earth was beginning to change. On the morning of May 5th, a new chapter in the volcano's unrest began, one that could no longer be ignored. Heavy rains had fallen the night before, mixing with loose volcanic ash on the slopes of Mount Pelée. Just before 7 a.m., the pressure gave way. A massive lahar, a fast-moving torrent of mud, ash, and debris, surged down the Rivière Blanche Valley. The torrent overwhelmed a sugar factory called Guérin, located just a few kilometers from the city. The building was swept away within minutes. Over 24 workers were killed, their bodies carried downstream or buried beneath the muck. Survivors described it as a tidal wave of boiling mud, a dark, unstoppable mass that consumed everything in its path. Panic began to ripple through the population. Smoke and ash now regularly choked the streets. Tremors shook the earth at night. Birds were disappearing. Insects had gone silent. The mountain's growl was now a daily presence. But official voices continued to downplay the situation. The colonial governor, Louis Moutet, visited Saint-Pierre the very next day, not to evacuate the city, but to calm fears. Scientists from the local observatory insisted the mud flow was not a sign of eruption, but the result of rain. A bulletin was published, reassuring the public there was no reason for alarm. And once again, people stayed. Evacuation wasn't just discouraged, it was seen as unnecessary. Some even feared it would cause mass hysteria or disrupt the upcoming legislative elections scheduled for May 11th. And so, life in Saint-Pierre continued, under the shadow of a mountain that had now killed and was not finished. While Martinique tried to explain away the destruction at Guérin, tragedy struck elsewhere, with terrifying clarity. On May 6th, just one day after the Lahar, a separate eruption shook the island of St. Vincent, roughly 160 kilometers south. There, the volcano La Soufrière exploded with terrifying force. The eruption unleashed columns of ash that rose over 10 kilometers into the atmosphere. Pyroclastic flows, searing avalanches of gas and rock, tore through villages and farmland. The scale of devastation was immense. Over 1,600 people died, and thousands more were left injured or homeless. Ash darkened the skies as far as Barbados, 180 kilometers to the east. In Saint-Pierre, the news spread quickly. People were frightened. Some hoped it meant Pelee had released its energy indirectly, that perhaps this was the end. Others feared it was just the beginning. La Soufrière and Mount Pelée are both part of the Lesser Antilles volcanic arc, fueled by the same tectonic forces. To volcanologists, this sudden regional activity was not coincidence. It was a warning. But again, the message from officials was unwavering. Saint-Pierre was told to stay calm, and it did. By that evening, over 29,000 people remained in the city. The eruption on St. Vincent showed what a Caribbean volcano could do. It was the deadliest volcanic eruption since the legendary eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. But Mount Pelée had not yet spoken. May 8th, 1902. It was a Thursday. In Saint-Pierre, bells rang through the morning mist. Shops opened and bakers sold their bread. Children played on the streets. The sky had changed, though. The air hung heavy, like the island was holding its breath. The mountain, which had been rumbling for days, now growled with a deep, guttural force. But there were no alarms, no evacuations. Then, just before 8 a.m., the ground trembled. Birds flew in frantic circles, horses bolted, and high above, from the heart of Mount Pelée, something terrible awakened. What happened next was unlike anything the Caribbean had ever seen. For weeks, Mount Pelée had been tightening, like a clenched fist. Beneath its summit, a slow, seething force had been building. Gas, ash, and molten rock surged upward, but the peak was sealed, capped by a thick crust of hardened lava, formed during earlier eruptions. The mountain was swelling, straining against its own skin. Each tremor was a warning, each puff of ash a sign of pressure rising. And on the morning of May 8th, that pressure could no longer be contained. At exactly 7:52 a.m., the dome burst. One eyewitness would later say, "The mountain was blown to pieces." What erupted from Mount Pelée was not lava, but something far more devastating. It was a nuée ardente, a term not widely known at the time. Today, we call it a pyroclastic surge, a fast-moving, ground-hugging cloud of gas, ash, and volcanic fragments, heated to temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Imagine a blast furnace stretching for miles, unleashed not upward, but sideways, hurtling straight down the mountain at the speed of a jetliner. Within seconds, the flanks of Pelee disintegrated. The forest was flattened. Rivers evaporated. The earth turned white hot. The surge swept down toward Saint-Pierre, a wall of fire, ash, and poisoned wind moving at over 160 kilometers per hour. No sound could outrun it. No wall could stop it. Witnesses from the sea described the moment it struck. A great black cloud, dense and churning, wrapped in lightning and trailing flames, rolled across the city like a living creature. It wasn't a wave. It was an avalanche made of atmosphere itself. Saint-Pierre didn't burn. It ignited. Wooden houses exploded into flame. Roofs were torn away. The stone cathedral crumbled. The iron framework of the theater twisted like paper. Bodies were flash-burned where they stood. Some caught mid-motion, running, praying, shielding children. Even the harbor was not spared. Ships anchored offshore caught fire where they floated. Sailors, watching in horror, were blinded by ash before they could turn away. The surge lasted less than 2 minutes, but that was all it took. A city of nearly 30,000 souls erased by a force as old as the planet itself, a volcanic wind that seared the earth and consumed everything it touched. And then, silence. The mountain at last had spoken. Saint-Pierre was gone. At 7:52 a.m. on May 8, 1902, the city was annihilated by one of the most devastating forces nature can unleash, a pyroclastic surge. Nearly 30,000 people perished in less than 2 minutes, making the eruption of Mount Pelée the deadliest volcanic disaster of the 20th century. News of the eruption traveled quickly. Within days, newspapers around the world described a city erased from the earth. But what shocked people most was how sudden it had been, how a thriving city could vanish in an instant. The city that was known as the Paris of the Caribbean was never rebuilt to its former glory. The island's capital shifted to Fort-de-France, where it remains today. Parts of Saint-Pierre were resettled over time, but the soul of the city, its people, culture, and prominence, was lost. The eruption of 1902 changed how the world viewed volcanoes. Before Mount Pelée, the phenomenon of pyroclastic surges was poorly understood. The term itself had barely entered the scientific vocabulary. Today, Mount Pelée is closely monitored by modern instruments and international observatories. But the story of Saint-Pierre remains a permanent warning. It was a real city, filled with real people, parents, children, living their lives beneath a mountain they thought they understood. And in less than 2 minutes, they were gone.